All right, we're recording now, so I'll just leave this thing around my neck for the duration of today. Charge it up at half time. So, as you can guess, late adulthood, 65 years on, which I think in the future probably won't be defined as 65 years plus. I reckon we'll have like 65 to 75 and then 75 plus, purely because the age of our population is increasing. And my honest opinion is I think this is going to be a boom sector over the next 20 years. And if you're wanting to forge a career, my opinion, work with oldies and work with kids. I reckon they're the two boom sectors, to be quite honest. And particularly the oldies, because our healthcare system, even now, is straining under the load of managing the burden of chronic disease from this population. So I know I've mentioned this example before, but medical technology is something we're really good at. So we're keeping people alive for longer. We're creating synthetic hearts and we're doing all these funky procedures. Our biotech is really good. Now we've got people like Ian Fraser, Australian of the Year, who works at UQ inventing the vaccine for cervical cancer. We've got stuff like that going on that we're probably world leaders at. But how we manage that increased age span is a whole other sort of kettle of fish. So as a case in point, we put a new heart in somebody that's had chronic heart failure several times. We give them these vaccines, we keep them alive for longer. But how do we manage metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cancer, all of these chronic diseases? How do you think we do as a public healthcare system at managing chronic disease? And I've kind of overlaid it with my opinion, but tell me your thoughts. With your personal experiences with your grandparents or your parents or relatives. Thanks, anyone not put their attendance on this yet? All good?
You haven't got to go into a doctor's surgery. Elderly people are in there waiting to see a doctor, but I think they come from that generation that a pill's going to fix everything.
And if they're being treated by a GP who might be of the same vintage,
yes.
Let's talk about how a consult with a general practitioner might look. So you go into your doctor's surgery, and the older generation, you're exactly right, are of the opinion that anything that's wrong with me, I have to see my doctor. Because 20 years ago, there were no such thing as occupational therapists or exercise physiologists or all these other allied health professions that are now starting to shine and get their place in the sun. The older generation are blissfully unaware that this support exists. So whatever's wrong, you've got to go to your doctor, your GP. And then they go in to see their GP, and tell me how you think that consultation might roll, given that it's usually a short consult because Medicare rewards GPs for the short consult. It's how they get the most money from Medicare, hence another issue with the system. But anyway, they're not going to provide a long consult in most cases because they don't get as much money. Right, so a short consult is under 15 minutes. Talk to me about how that 10 to 15 minutes is generally spent. Okay, so generally speaking, the doctor will say, hey, how can I help you today? And then what will the older adult say? Either I'm here to get a script refilled, but let's put that aside for a moment. They've got an issue that they want to discuss. So the older adult might say, oh, I'm noticing my vision is a bit blurry and I'm a bit unsteady on my feet. And the doctor might ask some questions, put some clinical notes into the software program that's on the laptop, do a few tests, gathered some information. Then what's the next step that usually happens? Yeah, correct. So I'm going to write you a script and or a referral. Boom, done. Maybe both. Here's a script for this, and I want you to go and get this test. off you go. Then that person goes away. They get those tests done, they fill that script, and they come back in a month or so. Okay, let's have a look at those test results. Based on the test results, there's usually another script that's written. Okay, I want you to now take this to try and manage your vertigo or your tinnitus or whatever it is that might be causing the unsteadiness on the feet. And away you go. And then the older adult goes home, they go to the pharmacist to get the script filled. The pharmacist goes, holy smoke, you're on about 15 different meds. We better get a Webster pack organised for you. And a Webster pack is one of those little boxes, Monday through Sunday, and they will put all the pills that they have to take each day in each day. In the pack, and away they go. If they're lucky, a home medical review might be done by a trained pharmacist, where the pharmacist comes into the older person's home, looks in their cupboard, usually in the bathroom, and goes, that was out of date 5 years ago. That was out of date 2 years ago. That's just out of date. Let's throw all those out. Oh, your Webster pack. Oh, you got confused. You missed this day, blah, blah, blah. Let's get all this tidied up. If they're lucky. And that's generally the way the treatment of an older adult goes.
I think with my personal experience that there's not enough allied health, especially when you go to nursing homes.
Yep. So tell me about that.
Well, a lot of the rural areas only have visiting allied professionals, so like physios and whatnot.
Yep.
Where mum was, they had a husband and wife thing, and they decided to go on 3 months overseas trip.
Yep.
So they only got one replacement for the 3 months. All those with high care required 2 people. Nurses wouldn't assist. So therefore, anyone with high care didn't get treatment for the 3 months. And the lack of services around in the rural and regional areas, they're finding it hard to get the professionals in.
So which allied health professionals do you think need to be providing services more in some of those settings?
Probably physiologists, probably even like remedial therapists, like massage therapists and whatnot as well.
Yeah, dietetics.
In the nursing homes, probably not as much because they're already pretty controlled with their meals.
If they purchase them there. What if they're independent living in a higher care environment? Because what tends to happen when people age to their taste and their preferred type of food that they will consume. Let's assume they're in low care, and I'm going to reflect on my grandparents' experiences here. So transition from their own home, which it's always kicking and screaming. It's like their last bastion of independence is living in their own home. But if there are stairs, they have a fall. This is what happened to both of my grandparents. So that provides the rationale you can't stay in your own home. You have what's called an Egghead Assessment, where an OT will come and have a look at the environment, and they will do some tests, and they'll categorise your risk. And if you've had an Egghead Assessment and the recommendation is you should go into a care facility, we now have various scales or gradings of care, right? So you can go in as, this is my grandparents, right? They go into a unit in a retirement village setting where they live independently, but there's distress buttons that they can press, and they have a distress button necklace that they can put on, and there's people on call there and so on and so forth. Okay, so in that environment, that's usually the first transition. In terms of care that's provided, unless it's coming from the community and they're organising it through their GP, there really isn't anything.
A lot of those sorts of places have community centres that they do community classes.
Yeah, sure.
And like healthy cooking
Yep.
and whatnot.
Yep.
Environments, but
some diversional therapy. Sometimes they have a diversional therapist. They have to vote in to do it. And often people will join in if there's a social element. A good case in point, where I was working in Harvey Bay, we provided an osteoporosis prevention program at the TAFE gym, and they would come up twice a week. But in order to get them up there, I went down to their community hall, which was near the bowling green. This was an over 50s village, right? And they love going to that community centre because they have drinks there. They have happy hour twice a week, right, between 5 and 6, or it's half price drinks. And they get to play cards and have a chat. So it's brilliant socially. So if you want to get a message out, you've got to get to the community centre because that's where they all hang out. Or 80% of them will all hang out there. Some will vote out of that and choose to be socially isolated, but most will go there. Then you'll deliver classes there, or you can tell them about what you want to do at your premises. So yeah, hopefully, I think probably the dietetics, there could be a need for that for those that are still living independently. To an extent, and I'll reflect on my grandfather. So he lost his wife, lost his grandmother, and he was the cook all along anyway, so he continued to look after himself, did a good job, then had to transition into high care. So you move from one part of the village to the next. Your meals are then provided, but you've still got a kitchenette. And that's important because you have to allow people to feel like they have some control and they can have some of their own food there. But what do you think started to go into his fridge in that kitchenette? Yeah, all the sweet stuff. So it was basically just ice cream, you know, the frozen fruits that you would buy, all the frozen desserts and all the chocolate custards, and like it was just like diabetes waiting to happen. Now he had the choice to be able to get his meals, but he's like, no, I'm good. And the meals that my mother would pre-cook and go in and put them in the freezer, they just sit there. Then when you go to the next step, it's like, nah, you just get your meals delivered each time, and then you have some control. Then you probably need the dietitians to speak to who's making the meals to get that side of it sorted.
Did he like sweet stuff all his life though?
No.
That's weird because I've lost my craving for sugar years ago. Like, you know, when you're a kid, you just couldn't have the sugar. Like now, I'd rather have bitter stuff, savoury stuff. Like,
Mum went much the same way, but when she went into the nursing home and towards the end, she was like always wanting the chocolates and the lollies and stuff.
Your taste buds change. So your sense of taste starts to diminish. And as a result, you kind of need more sweet stuff to try and get that stimulus. Plus, I think towards end of life, there's a lack of motivation to kind of eat well. And you've got to remember, a lot of the older adults now didn't have the grounding and the education that we have around better, healthy eating choices. So maybe it's a combination of things that leads to that. When we went there a few years ago, I took my daughters down, took the family down to see him. And his treat for my granddaughters was, I think I told you this last week, soaking strawberries in caster sugar for like 5 hours beforehand and ice cream, and just load up on that. All right, so what I want you to do straight up, and I'm going to debrief with some of the stats around this. I want you to try and find out the percentage of population over 65 in our local area, in the state, and in the country. So just percentages are fine, of 65 years plus, or if you can't hit that exact number, just get around the mark and see what stats you can find. Remember that Australian Institute of Health and Welfare site that we've been looking at the last few weeks would probably be the place that I would start because it'll grab the last census data. And global. World Health Organization will have some of these global stats for you, and then try and identify how that trend has changed over the last 10 years in terms of the percent of people from 65 plus. Give me an indication of the delta, in other words, how much it has changed. And then think about what implications this has for public health. We've already touched on that a little bit, but you know, it's kind of like a tsunami coming, the increasing aged population. How do we deal with this? Are we equipped to deal with it? If not, how can we be better equipped? So feel free to work together on this, but do some digging, see what you can find, and then we'll have a debrief. All right, guys, we might keep ploughing on because we've still got a little bit to get through. So just sticking with those psychosocial elements that we were speaking about just before the break, I think this first point is a pertinent one. When older adults reach a certain stage where all their friends and other family members start passing away, that becomes a difficult adjustment time for them. Because obviously a lot of their social network is kind of breaking down and they need to rely on other, more immediate family members. So I guess that's a little bit, once again, a loss of identity and a loss of socialisation and independence to an extent, because they're now reliant upon immediate family for their socialisation to a larger extent as well. I know this was a real issue with my grandfather because he was a World War II veteran, and when the guys who still lived around his area that were also war veterans started passing away, like things like Anzac Day became quite hard for him from that perspective. However, before that period of time, so from the ages of, say, 60 to 65, there is this period of reinvention. And we might even be able to extend this to 70 because the age of retirement is always being pushed north. So that kind of, like, a lot of people think that when people retire, that's when they kind of down tools and that's pretty much it. Whereas in reality, a lot of people reach this age and they think, okay, well, what's next? And there are a couple of different ways that I think older adults approach this. Some of them just say, okay, well, the attitude is I'm done now. I've contributed. This is me. I don't need to change. This is how I'm going to be for the rest of my days. Whereas others do go through this period of reinvention and redefining who they are and what they're going to do. And they'll take up new hobbies and form different friends and they'll start traveling more, etc., etc. So I guess the last point in that previous slide is accurate in that it really is a search for meaning. So for the next 20 to 30 years, what is my life going to be about? Almost like a midlife crisis happening all over again. So these two tasks relate quite nicely to what we were just speaking about. So there's a reflection on the past, accepting what's been and done. And if you have that sense of fulfillment with what you've achieved and what you've contributed, so that kind of, disappointment, failure versus success, and that integrated view of self is a nice way of, I think, summing that up. And then after that reconciliation, then as we were saying on the previous slide, establishing new goals and challenges and that period of reinvention, redefining what my life is going to be for the next 20 to 30 years. Hence, that can be a good opportunity for the older adult to diversify and develop new skills and take on new hobbies and, different thought processes than what they've done for the previous sort of 60 years. All right, so segueing now, I mentioned earlier that we'd speak about Alzheimer's and some neurodegenerative conditions that affect the older adult. I want you to have a look at this image to the right. I might even try and make that a little bit bigger. The healthy brain versus the Alzheimer's brain. Can you see that okay? Or do you want me to make it larger? Bigger? Yeah. Better? So tell me what you notice when you look at that image in terms of the changes from healthy brain to the Alzheimer's affected brain.
The Alzheimer's brain is smaller. It looks like it's shriveled up.
Yes, exactly. So there's been a significant loss of brain tissue, degeneration. That's the first thing you notice. What about the neuron, which you can see below the healthy brain and below the Alzheimer's brain?
Can't see the nucleus.
Yeah, correct. So on the healthy neuron, we can see quite a well-defined, good-sized nucleus. And we've got the cell body. Can you remember what the long extension was called? Yeah, the axon and these other smaller ones. Dendrites. Beautiful. Okay. So that's the aspects or elements of a healthy neuron, whereas over here, as you pointed out, the cell body and the nucleus are obviously much smaller. And there are these tangles where the dendrites seem to be shriveled up, and the axon seems to be a lot smaller as well. So there's that degeneration at a cellular level, at the neuron level. And most theories center around the accumulation of a particular type of protein that's responsible for this. Tau, T-A-U. So if you do some research around that, telomeres we're going to speak about separately, but it can interfere with the edges of the telomeres. We'll talk about that when we talk about cell division and how many times a cell can actually divide and reproduce before the telomere starts to become frayed away. So hold that thought. Tau is a protein that accumulates, and it creates these tangles where the dendrites don't have clear pathways and don't articulate with other neurons. This tau is like a protein that lodges itself onto the dendrite and then sort of interferes with its ability to communicate to neighbouring neurons. Hence why you can see the atrophy in terms of the reduction of size, not only of the brain as a whole, but also at a neuronal level. And you can see that tau if you look at MRI scans of the Alzheimer's brain. You can see it as dark shades where that protein is accumulated. Now, the problem is, unless people go and have an MRI scan of their brain, it's very hard to know that this stuff is accumulating, and it happens very gradually. So the symptoms are quite slow in terms of onset, but becomes more rapid as one gets older. There's another condition that I've done some research into that also has identified this link with this tau protein. It's called CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy. If anyone's interested, I'll write that down or talk to you about it later. But they found this when researching the brains of deceased NFL footballers, is where this started about 5 years ago. And because they're wearing the helmets and the concussive forces, they found that a lot of retired NFL players had. So they started suffering real mental health issues, you know, aggression and memory loss and increased incidence of suicide. So they started doing brain biopsies, and they found that this protein was predominant. Sometimes these brains, you know how I said they look dark and cloudy on an MRI? It was almost like that's all there was. There was so much tau in some of these brains. And they're hypothesizing right now that these repeated concussive forces can lead to an early onset and accumulation of that tau. And I think there's actually a class action going on at the moment through the NFL Players Association against the NFL about player welfare. And I think we're starting to see that come over to sports like AFL, NRL, rugby union over here about that duty of care. Never used to be an issue, but now we see a lot more things being put in place because of the existence of some of this research. And even recently, there have been players like I know Ian Roberts, who used to play for Manly in the NRL. He's now looking to take legal action because he feels that there wasn't a duty of care or a reasonable duty of care extended to him during his playing career. And he's now suffering short-term memory and some other mental health issues that he is saying is as a result of the concussions he suffered when playing. Yep. And they had the head injury assessment. So it's been mandated that each club has a doctor on the sideline, And as soon as there's a suspected incidence of concussion, they have to undergo that injury assessment by the doctor in the change rooms. And sometimes they're allowed back on. If they fail the test, they're not. So that's a part of the player welfare risk management policy that's now being brought in off the back of some of what we're finding out about this. And it's all coming from America in the NFL research. And there's even like the doctors have access, they sit in a little tent on the sideline with a TV so they can replay the incident. So as the player's coming off with the trainer, the doctor can see what the mechanism of injury is and then treat accordingly. To be honest, I think they're really scared of class actions and legally what's going to happen. So you look at all those images of, say, State of Origin years ago, players that have been knocked senseless and just, you know, the trainer's dragging them up and putting them back in the defensive line or whatnot. I think, yeah. Yep. But now we know this stuff is a thing, and there've been some players that have come forward. Another guy called Michael Luck from the Cowboys, not Michael Luck, Sean Valentine, he got knocked senseless quite a few times and had some real serious mental health issues. You know, would wake up in the morning, couldn't remember where his keys were. There was an article written on Inside Sport that I read, and he was one of the cases in point. And the reason they're doing it is so they don't get sued. But I still think watch this space in the next few years. There'll be legal action for sure off the back of this and player welfare. I'll just make sure there wasn't anything else I wanted to hit off on there. I guess hand in hand, we've spoken a lot about Alzheimer's, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, and I'll play you a little video from a person that suffers Alzheimer's that'll kind of hit home about the impact that can have. Looking at disability and its impact on psychological health and welfare, we've now got the onset and progression of osteoarthritis that impacts mobility, and therefore you can't do what you want to do or used to be able to do. And that has a real impact on quality of life. I'm going to skip over that one. Actually, I'm going to go forward to this one now that we're talking about Alzheimer's. And I'm just going to play you, what is it? This video. So this is a daughter speaking to her mother who has Alzheimer's, and I'll just give you an idea as to sort of impact.
But when people die in their sleep, they usually have a heart attack. You know, so he probably had a heart attack in his sleep. I thought he was still living. Well, if he was living, he'd be by your side. Well, I thought he was around. You're stuck with me, lady.
Anyway, I don't think we need to go through the whole thing, but obviously pretty debilitating and hard for the families too. I remember doing some work in a nursing home when I was at uni, and they put us in the dementia ward, and it just knocked our socks off in terms of what we saw and the behaviours and whatnot. You know, just sporadic, impulsive behaviour, lots of repetition, so you'd have the same conversations each week, and yeah, it progresses from there to where they don't know what they are missing. You know what I mean? But then it just becomes harder on the relatives and the families because they just have to introduce themselves all the time. Like we go up to the same guys every week and introduce ourselves. You know, I'm Brad. I'm studying uni, and you just repeat the same thing week in, week out. Hence why there's a lot of research going into this at the moment. Yep. Absolutely. Nothing wrong with the long-term memory. So they can remember what happened 23 years ago like it was yesterday. And often that's a point of regression. They'll go back to those memories because that's what's embedded. It's the short-term stuff that goes. Like they'll wake up in the morning and they won't know where they are or who the person is that's coming into the room. They lose that. But then there are these moments of clarity. My grandmother had this where all of a sudden she'd remember who a person was, and they'd start asking, be quite lucid and ask questions like, oh, how's Brad? How are the twins? What's going on here? And it was just like there was no onset of Alzheimer's at all. But then the next day it'd be completely different. But yeah, you're right. The default position is to go back to what happened 30, 40 years ago because those memories are ingrained. And the diagnosis of depression, well, you can see why anxiety would be huge, particularly if there's another pathology like Alzheimer's involved. Anxiety would be a significant factor, but depression is also quite prevalent too. So between 10 to 15% of Australians, I'm surprised that's not higher. They would be the diagnosed and reported cases of depression. I think there would be a significantly higher number that just don't say anything and don't get diagnosed. So I wouldn't be surprised if that's more than double that, particularly as function is being lost. And if they haven't gone through that period of redefining themselves we spoke about previously, I guess that could be really hard. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Yes. Yep. And they have to make new social contacts, or well, they can choose not to, I suppose. Every weekend, I take my daughters down to the service station so my wife can have a bit of a sleep in, and we get a coffee and a hot chocolate and that sort of stuff. And there's a guy there that we speak to every week, and he goes to that. How old would he be? He'd be 70 odd, and he goes to that service station. It's one of those BP Wild Bean Cafe ones every morning because he's in the habit of waking up early and he suffers depression, and his wife kicks him out of the house. Doesn't want him in there waking her up and whatnot. So he goes there every day. So we've just started talking, and he's a very intelligent guy. He used to be a scientist for the government. And we got to talking about urban design and how it impacts physical activity. You know, the amount of green space and how you design houses and communities to improve energy expenditure and population health. And so I ended up printing out one of the articles, and I said, I'll bring you some. He said, I'd be interested to see some of that research. So I found one and brought it in, and now that's what we're sort of talking about. And I want to try and gradually incorporate some of the evidence around exercise to treat depression and improve mood. And maybe that'll be the next step. I'm kind of nudging towards bringing in a paper on that and going, hey, have a read of this. But yeah, he seems quite isolated and just goes there for a coffee every morning and reads the paper. His wife isn't helping him, no. Get out of the house. But he's gone through a period of that redefining himself. He now calls himself a political animal. So he now researches politics. And God, those conversations are like a fork into the eye for me, to be honest. But I know it's good for him because that's his new identity, in a sense, to chat about that stuff. And look at this percentage down here. The rate of depression, much, much higher in people living in residential aged care facilities. They've lost that sense of independence. Yeah, you're exactly right. You're exactly right. Yep. Yes. And sometimes they feel awkward because you're awkward. You know what I mean? They know that they can't do much. You know, before they'd get you the strawberries in caster sugar and whatnot, that's something they can do, so they're happy with that. Yep. Same, we used to go for happy hour and you can meet their mates and whatnot, and they're quite proud to say, this is so-and-so. This is my grandson. All right, I think we've spoken about most of those points. Yeah, yep. Yeah, lack of hygiene. And some of that, I think, well, what do you think that's the case? Maybe. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting to think on why that might be the case. Because we had to get cleaners in for my granddad. It was the same situation. It was a little studio, high care apartment, but the cleaners had to come in every couple of days. Mum would have to clean the fridge out and all that sort of jazz.
My mum was never big on housework anyway. When she was younger, but now she's from that era where men never did housework. They all want to work in the yard. He's mobile.
Yep.
He's never picked up a vacuum cleaner in his life.
Yeah. That role definition's embedded. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, it's that loss of independence again, isn't it? I know my in-laws are still the same as your parents, very embedded into those roles that have been defined early. So he was a farmer, she was the housewife, she's never worked. And when they come to visit, every meal, like she goes and gets it, even if one of us has cooked it, and she'll be the one to put it in front of him, and she'll say, Rob, would you like a cup of tea with your dinner? Like it's that kind of, this is my job, this is what I do, regardless of whether we've retired and moved on to another stage of our lives or not. And then every now and then she'll get cranky and say, get up and get it your bloody self. I think, yeah, looking at these first 2 points up here, we'll probably see more research coming out of that, which is if you're physically active during your formative years and into mid-adulthood, what sort of protective impact does that have moving forward? So the research might come out that says if you've engaged in so much physical activity between ages X and Y, then that has a protective effect against these types of changes into late adulthood. I'm sure that link exists, and obviously very hard to study and put numbers around because you've got to follow people longitudinally for a long period of time. All right, I'm just going to pick a couple of other points here. No, we've unpacked that one. This is what I wanted to talk to you about just very briefly, and that is biological aging. So we've spoken previously about chronological versus biological age. Remind me again what those two terms mean. Yes.
From the effects of your other environmentals. So, like if you lived a sedentary life, if you lived an active life, it will affect your biological age.
How old your system is, essentially. So you can have a chronological age of 40, but a biological age of 60. And people will say, I've had a hard life. That's essentially what that's referring to. And there was this point in here around free radicals, and I'm going to show you a short video on this at the moment. And free radicals being something that causes a lot of damage to other cells in the body and can hasten the aging process because of that cellular damage. So if you look at, this is the free radical, if you can see this atom on your left. Now atoms are complete, if you like, when they have pairs of electrons in each of these rings. So you can see in the first ring there's a pair, and in the outer ring there are two pairs. But here we have some damage. Well, this free radical is termed a free radical because it only has one electron here, it doesn't have a pair. So that free radical wants to go and find another electron to make it complete. So it starts bouncing into all these other cells trying to steal an extra electron. That's the nature of atoms, right? And each time it tries to steal an extra electron, it damages that other atom. So these free radicals kind of bounce around, causing damage to cells. Now, the theory is that antioxidants, which obviously in certain fruits and supplements and whatnot, are happy to donate an electron to the free radical so it can become a whole atom again and stop bouncing around and causing havoc. Does that make sense? And it's that havoc that speeds up the aging process. Let me see, not that one, not that one, not that one, this one.
Have been linked to a number of diseases, including diabetes, coronary heart disease, and cancer. Much like high cholesterol, they are a warning sign of trouble down the road. While a certain amount of free radical activity in our bodies is normal, a variety of factors can lead to unsafe levels. An unhealthy diet, smoking, stress, injury, toxins, and pollutants in our air and water. In reality, the culprit is us. Fortunately, there are ways to defend our bodies against the harmful effects of free radicals. Antioxidants help our body fight back and repair itself from the inside out. They give free radicals the electron they're looking for, stabilizing them before they damage our cells. Increasing your antioxidant consumption on a daily basis has been shown to lower free radical levels and promote better health.
All right, any questions on that? I think that summed up quite nicely, to be honest. All right, I'm going to change gears a little, and We'll do some practical work in a tick with some of these implements I've brought. But I want to talk to you more pragmatically about strength training in the older adults. So this is a presentation I gave last year at a fitness conference over in Indonesia. And I've shown you some of these slides before. So we've looked at the bone bank, so we've covered that. We looked at the stats around Asian countries, fracture sites. So this is what a neck of femur looks like, that fracture. See how it breaks off right there? So it's not actually up here in the acetabulum, it's that neck of femur where most hip fractures occur. We looked at what the BMD scans look like. We've looked at the BMU and the osteoblasts and clasts. Okay, so in terms of improving bone density, two mechanisms. One, the pull of a tendon on bone. So if you contract a muscle, you have to pull the tendon, yeah? The tendon attaches to a bone. So this direction of force, which is going up this way to pull the lower arm up, so imagine this is a bicep curl, creates a stimulus that will enable those osteoblasts to become more active. Plus, weight-bearing impact exercise will result in an increase in bone mineral density. So I've presented that like an equation for that reason. It's all well and good. You've got to have the pull of the tendon on bone. But if you're doing that in a pool, and that's the only physical activity you get, you can see you're not going to have the same positive outcome. And there have been some studies done in the UK around step aerobics that show that that's one of the main forms of exercise that can be beneficial for increasing bone density because of that impact. Okay, we'll skip over that one. All right, so the key is stimulating the axial skeleton, which is what? Have you covered axial versus appendicular skeleton in bio or anatomy yet? And it's okay to say no. And just look at me and go, I don't know what you're talking about. So axial skeleton, we're talking about the spine and the pelvis. So the axis, if you like. Because we know that the lumbar spine and the hip are two of the most common sites for osteoporosis, that's where we want to put some of that compressive load. So therefore, exercises like squatting, she's got really good technique, hey? Deadlifting, lunging, overhead pressing are all going to create that compressive force through the spine. So a lot of studies look at bicep curl, which is nice, but I haven't seen many diagnoses of osteoporosis in the arm. All right, now the other side to that equation is replicating ADLs, which are activities of daily living. So how can we make ADLs easier for people to give them that sense of accomplishment and give them more independence? So if you look, standing from a chair is essentially a squat. Getting up off the toilet is essentially a squat. Picking something up from the ground is a deadlift. Think about the washing basket. To pick that up from the ground, that's a deadlift. I had a lady at home recently where one of her exercises was to load the washing into the basket, have the basket like this, and then just pick that up half a dozen times before she took it out to the clothesline. Something really simple like that. And putting an object on a shelf or getting something down off a shelf is an overhead press. Hanging the washing on the line. All right, this is what I want you to do. I want you to come and have a play with some of these items. So you've got a slam ball. You've got a strength tube. And there's a suspension trainer that I'll hook up to that door. And you can have a play with designing some functional exercises to help older adults improve function and improve bone mineral density. Let's just hope no one opens this door. Okay, come and have a play. Come up with some exercises. All right, we'll do this as a very short discussion, then I'll let you go. But the first tutorial question is, explain the nature of the continued decline in physical functions and characteristics, including cognitive decline in late adulthood. Why do individual variations occur and what can be done to ensure a better quality of life? And then there's a chapter reference there. So if we break that question down, what do you think it's actually asking you to do? It's a long way of asking you to do a pretty simple thing. Yeah, so it's asking about prevention. So how can we improve quality of life? What's the first part asking you to do? Describe the change. So what deteriorates and how can you improve quality of life? So I'm saying this for the online guys as well, right? That seems to be a complex question, but really it's not. So if you were to sum up for me in 30 seconds, what are some of the major areas of decline in late adulthood? What would you say to me? So what happens to bone strength? Okay, so increased osteoclast activity resulting in lower bone density. Good. Did I paraphrase that well? Good. Okay, next one. What's another change? This is good revision for the exam too, by the way. Okay, so replace the word tension. So just say reduced elasticity of soft tissue. So what implications might that have if the muscles and tendons are stiffer? Yeah, so it's going to impact range of movement, which is then going to predispose the older adult to things like falls. Yes. Okay, what other changes take place?
What about vision? Talk about macular
degeneration?
degeneration.
No, we didn't.
Oh.
But you're no. Everyone else is going bloody. Don't say anything. No, if you, when you want those slides, send me an email and I'll flick them through because I put some images there of I think a cataract in there and macular degeneration. So what actually happens with your vision as you age, you kind of get this grey film over the eye and the drainage of fluid around the eye isn't as good. So pressure starts going back onto the retina and the optic nerve and damage starts happening that way. Depth perception, yep. Don't get started on driving. Yeah, which again can lead to falls and injury.
Did you say pressure on the optic nerve? Yeah. Oh, that's what I had a scan at the optometrist about 12 months ago and they showed and you can actually see the optic nerve.
What was their prognosis?
It's fine for my age. They said just keep coming back every 2 years. I think you can get it done under Medicare.
Yep.
Yeah, they said it's normal.
So if you look at this, this is glaucoma. Normal eye. An eye with glaucoma. So you can see here, this drainage canal is blocked. So if you can't relieve or release some of that fluid, the pressure just builds back and damages that optic nerve. So it's about ensuring that you can get that proper drainage happening. And I did put a link in there around cataracts as well. Yeah, these two can particularly lead to, blind spots and a reduced field of vision as well. All right, now to finish off, what are some of the interventions, going back to that tutorial question, that might improve quality of life in light of those degenerations you've just mentioned? So increased levels of physical activity, yes. Increased weight-bearing activity too. To do what? What are we hoping to achieve through increased weight-bearing? To improve or prevent the loss in bone mineral density and improve functional strength to perform activities of daily living. Give me one more thing, then you can go. Okay, nice. So performing mobility tasks to maintain elasticity of soft tissues like muscles and tendons. Improve range of movement, improve gait, reduce risk of falls, improve mobility, therefore improve quality of life. Nicely done.
I was just going to say, what would you do to try and slow down this eyesight degeneration?
Not much. Not much for that one.
Carrots.
More carrots.
Carrots.
More beta carotene. I tell my daughters the same thing.
Diabetes could affect that.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, diabetes is a little bit different. So through elevated levels of sugar in the blood over a long period of time can result in nerve damage at the back of the eye. It's called retinopathy. And that then leads to some of those vision issues, so restricted field, blind spots, etc. Yeah, that's through long term. So you're right in that, in terms of reducing that retinopathy, addressing diet, reducing the sugar content would be a good way to start. All right, next week we are going to do some revision for the exam, and then it's over to you guys. Have a good week.